Somewhere in Central Asia, the night arrives differently than it does in other places. It doesn't fall quickly the way it does in forests or cities, where the darkness pools between buildings and trees before it reaches the sky. On the steppe, the darkness comes from everywhere at once. The light simply drains out of the horizon slowly, evenly, without hurry, until the whole wide world has gone quiet and dark, and the stars are so close. You feel as though the sky has lowered itself to be near you. This is the steppe. Not a desert, though it can be dry. Not a plain exactly, though it is flat in places. The Kyrgyz steppe is a landscape of high-altitude grasslands, river valleys, and mountains that rise so dramatically from the surrounding terrain that they look less like geography and more like a statement. The Tian Shan range, the mountains of heaven, as the name translates, forms the spine of the land, and the steppe spreads out from its foothills in every direction. For thousands of years, people have lived in this landscape without settling it. That is the important distinction. Other civilizations built cities and stayed. The people of the steppe moved. They followed the grass, following the seasons, bringing their homes with them. The round felt tents called yurts, which could be assembled in an hour and disassembled in less. They knew the rivers by name, the passes through the mountains, the places where the grass was richest in spring. They carried their knowledge of the land, not in maps or books, but in memory. In the knowledge that passed from parent to child, elder to youth, voice to voice, across the generations. In this kind of world, a world without permanent walls, without written archives, without libraries, stories became the most important technology a people could possess. Not entertainment, technology. A story could hold a genealogy, a battle plan, a moral code, a history, a map, and a warning all at once, in a form that could be carried in a single human mind and delivered from one person to another in an evening around a fire. In a world where writing was either unavailable or simply impractical, the story was how a people knew who they were. The Kyrgyz people had many stories, but they had one story larger than all the others. Tonight, we are going to sit beside a fire on the steppe and listen to it. Picture a camp as the last light fades. A handful of yurts arranged in a loose circle, the felt walls silvery in the dusk, horses tethered nearby, grazing slowly, their shapes dissolving into shadow. The smell of wood smoke and something cooking, perhaps mutton, perhaps tea simmering on coals. Children running between the yurts, chased in by the cooling air as the temperature drops with the speed that high-altitude nights are known for. Inside the largest yurt, a fire burns in the central hearth. The smoke rises through the circular opening at the top, called the tunduk. That hole in the roof is also a window to the sky, and on clear nights you can lie on your back beneath it and watch the stars wheel slowly overhead. The felt walls trap the heat. The rugs on the floor are thick. There is light, warmth, and the particular smell of a fire that has been burning for hours, deep and woody and safe. People have gathered. Not just the family of this yurt, but neighbours, travellers who arrived at the camp before dark. There is tea, passed around in small bowls. There is food. There is conversation, quieter now as the night settles in. And then someone says, "Let the Manaschi speak." The Manaschi is the storyteller. More than that, he is the carrier of the epic. The man who holds the longest story ever told by a single people, and can deliver it, hour after hour, night after night, in verse, from memory, without a single written word in front of him. He sits near the fire. He does not begin immediately. There is a moment of silence, not awkward, but deliberate. a silence that prepares the air. And then he begins. What he begins is called Manas. It is an epic poem that may be the longest in the world, longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey combined, longer than the Mahabharata by some reckonings, though scholars debate the comparison. It tells the story of a hero, a warrior, a leader, a man born to unite a scattered people, and of the world he moved through, the enemies he faced, and the community he left behind when he was gone. But tonight in this yurt, none of that context matters yet. What matters is the fire, the warmth, the voice. The story is beginning. Before we talk about what Manas did, it's worth pausing on something simpler. Who was he? Not in the sense of biography dates, places, verified historical record. That kind of question doesn't quite fit Manas the way it fits other figures. He is not a historical person in the way that, say, a king whose name appears in a chronicle is a historical person. He exists in a different register. He is a figure that a people created over centuries through thousands of tellings to express something they needed to say about themselves. And what they needed to say was this: we are still here, we have endured, and this is how. The Kyrgyz people have lived in Central Asia for a very long time. Exactly how long is a question historians still argue about, but records of a people called the Kyrgyz or something close to that name appear in Chinese chronicles as far back as the 3rd century before Christ. That is more than 2,000 years of continuous presence in one of the most contested regions on Earth. Central Asia was not a quiet place to live. It was the crossroads of the ancient world. The Silk Road passed through it, which meant wealth, trade, and ideas moved through the region constantly, but it also meant armies moved through it. Alexander the Great came from the west. The Xiongnu Confederacy pressed from the east. The Tang dynasty of China extended its reach northward and westward in waves. The Mongols swept through in the 13th century with a force that reshaped every civilization they touched. The Timurids came after them, then other powers, other pressures, other disruptions. Through all of this, the Kyrgyz survived. Not always as a unified political force, they rarely had that kind of structure. They survived as a people, as a culture, as a set of values, practices, and memories carried forward in the minds of those who came after. A people under that kind of pressure needs a hero. Not just any hero, not someone who simply wins battles or accumulates glory. They need a hero who represents something true about themselves, who embodies the qualities they believe have allowed them to endure. Courage, yes, but also loyalty, generosity, the ability to unite people who might otherwise remain divided, the willingness to sacrifice everything for the community rather than the individual. Manas is that hero. In the epic, Manas is born under circumstances that immediately mark him as extraordinary. His birth is not an ordinary birth. The sky does not behave normally. Animals respond to his arrival. His father, Jakip, receives signs that this child is different, that he has come into the world for a purpose larger than a single family or a single generation. From childhood, Manas is physically exceptional. He is stronger than other children in the way that epic heroes always are, the kind of strength that reads less like a measurement and more like a symbol. He rides before other children can walk steadily. He fights before other boys have learned to hold a weapon properly. He is, the epic tells us, made for something. But here is what makes Manas interesting as a figure, and what separates him from some of the more one-dimensional heroes of epic literature. He is not invulnerable. He is not always right. He loses people he loves. He makes decisions that cost him. He carries grief alongside strength. And the grief is not presented as a weakness to overcome, but as part of what makes him real. He gets angry in ways that occasionally create more problems than they solve. His relationships with his wife, with his allies, with his father, are complicated by pride and misunderstanding, and the ordinary difficulties of human connection. He is a great man, but a man nonetheless, and the epic does not let him forget it, and does not let the audience forget it either. The world Manas moves through is recognizable to the people who have always told his story. The landscape is the Kyrgyz landscape, the mountains, the rivers, the open grazing land, the high mountain passes that are difficult to cross and therefore strategically important. The enemies are the enemies that the Kyrgyz people actually faced or remembered, facing Kalmyks, Chinese forces, various other powers that pressed on them from different directions. The social structures are familiar too. The relationships between tribe and tribe, the importance of alliance making, the tension between the independence of individual leaders and the need for unity when a larger threat appears. These are not invented difficulties placed in an epic for dramatic effect. They are the actual conditions of life on the steppe, translated into story. This is one of the reasons the epic survived for so long. It was not just entertainment. Every generation that heard it recognized their own world in it. The specific enemies changed. The political circumstances shifted. But the underlying shape of the challenge, how do scattered people with competing loyalties hold together against a stronger external force, remained constant. And so the story remained useful. There is a question that scholars have asked about Manas for a long time. Is there a real person behind the legend? The honest answer is, probably, in some sense, yes, and also no. Many epic heroes of this kind represent a blending of real historical figures across different periods. A great leader from the 9th century gets combined with a famous warrior from the 12th century, and the accumulated stories of both, and perhaps others, gradually merge into a single figure who is more representative than biographical. The specific man, if there ever was one specific man, becomes less important than the type he embodies. What the scholars can say is that the setting of the Manas epic, the period of intense pressure on the Kyrgyz people from various powerful neighbors, particularly from the east, corresponds roughly to real historical conditions in the period between the 9th and 15th centuries. The world the epic describes is not invented. It is a world that existed, a world in which people lived the kinds of lives the epic describes. Which means that even if Manas himself is a composite, a symbol, a figure assembled from many lives, the world he moves through is real. The difficulties he faces are real. And the values he represents were values that real people actually needed in order to survive. In Kyrgyz culture today, Manas is not a distant mythological figure in the way that, say, Zeus or Odin might be for people in the modern Western world, figures whose stories are known but who belong to a completed past, safely filed away as mythology. Manas is present. He appears on the currency. His monument stands in the capital city. His name is given to the international airport. Children learn episodes from his story in school. When people discuss Kyrgyz identity, what it means to be Kyrgyz, what the Kyrgyz people stand for, what history they carry with them, Manas is part of that conversation in an immediate and living way. He is not a relic. He is a reference point. And he is this because, for as long as anyone can remember, there have been people willing to stand up or sit down near a fire and tell his story again, to carry it forward. to add their own understanding to it and pass it on. Those people are the Manaschi. But before we meet them, there is one more thing worth saying about Manas himself. In the epic, there comes a moment, and we will return to this later, when Manas dies. Not in battle exactly, not in the simple way of a hero cut down at the height of his power. He dies at the edge of victory, in circumstances that are complicated and contested, in a way that leaves questions unanswered and grief unresolved. And the epic does not end there. The story continues through his son, and through the people he leaves behind, and through the memory of what he was. Because a hero of this kind is not primarily defined by what he does while he is alive. He is defined by what he leaves in the minds of the people who come after him. That is what makes him Manas, not the battles, not the victories. The memory. There is a particular kind of knowledge that cannot be written down. Not because the words don't exist for it, but because the act of writing it down would change what it is. A recipe written on paper is still a recipe. A map drawn in ink still describes a road. But some kinds of knowledge live in the body, in the breath, in the particular way a voice rises and falls when it has been doing something long enough that it no longer thinks about the doing. The Manaschi has that kind of knowledge. He, and sometimes she, though the tradition has been carried mostly by men, is not simply a performer, not simply a reciter. The Manaschi is something harder to translate into modern terms. Perhaps the closest word is keeper. He is the keeper of the epic, the living vessel of a story so large that no single mind should, by any ordinary reasoning, be able to hold it. And yet they do. To understand what the Manaschi actually does, you have to let go of the idea of memorization, as you probably understand it. When most people think of memorizing something long, they think of a fixed text, a poem, a speech, a script learned word for word, syllable by syllable, until it can be reproduced exactly. That kind of memorization is impressive, but essentially mechanical. The goal is perfect reproduction of something that already exists. The Manaschi does not work that way. What he carries is not a fixed text. It is a structure, a vast, intricate architecture of events, characters, relationships, and imagery that he can inhabit and move through, and from which he builds the performance as he goes. Each telling is shaped by who is listening, how long the night is, what mood the audience brings to the fire, what the occasion requires. A Manaschi performing at a wedding might emphasize certain episodes. One performing at a memorial might choose others. The shape of the telling changes. The underlying epic remains. This is why scholars who study oral epic traditions use the phrase composition in performance. The Manaschi is not recalling. He is creating, but creating within a tradition so deeply internalized that the creation feels, even to him, like remembering. The tradition of the Manaschi is ancient. Exactly how ancient is difficult to say with certainty. The epic itself is believed to have taken its recognizable shape somewhere between the 9th and 15th centuries, though its roots extend further back into the oral culture of the steppe. The Manaschi as a recognized role, a person specifically identified as the carrier of this story, probably developed alongside the epic itself over many generations. What we know more clearly is how the tradition worked, how a Manaschi came to be. There were two paths, and they are not as separate as they might seem. The first was apprenticeship. A young person, usually a boy, often one who showed early signs of a good memory and a natural feeling for language and rhythm, would attach himself to an established Manaschi. He would listen. For years, he would do almost nothing but listen. He would hear the same episodes told dozens of times in dozens of different ways. He would begin to feel the structure of the story from the inside, the way a musician feels the structure of a scale before they can explain what a scale is. Eventually, carefully, he would begin to try sections himself. The master would correct him not word by word, but in the larger sense of direction and feeling, and the rightness of the telling. And over years, sometimes many years, the apprentice would become a Manaschi in his own right. The second path was stranger. Many of the most celebrated Manaschi in the tradition describe their gift not as something learned, but as something received. They describe a dream. In the dream, Manas himself appears. Sometimes he appears alone. Sometimes he comes with his 40 warriors, the Kirk Choro, riding through the dreamer's sleeping mind with all the weight and presence of real men. And in the dream, Manas speaks to the dreamer. He tells them that they have been chosen, that they will carry his story, that beginning now, they will know things they did not know before. The dreamer wakes, and they find, to their astonishment, that it is true. Words are there that were not there before. Whole episodes of the epic arrive fully formed, as if they had always been present somewhere in the mind, and the dream had simply unlocked them. The Manaschi begins to speak, and what comes out is Manas. Now a reasonable modern listener might hear this and think, this is a story people tell about themselves, a way of explaining an unusual gift, a narrative that grants authority to the teller. And that is probably partly true, but it is worth sitting with the other possibility for a moment. These were people living in a culture where the boundary between sleeping and waking, between the ancestral world and the present one, was understood differently than it is in the modern Western world. Dreams were not psychological events to be analyzed. They were communications. They carried information. A dream in which a great ancestor appeared and spoke was not a metaphor. It was an encounter. Whether we share that understanding or not, something real is being described. The Manaschi who speaks of being chosen by Manas in a dream is describing an experience that felt, to him, completely literal. And the community around him, the people who listened and judged and decided whether this person carried the real thing, agreed that he did. Among all the Manaschi whose names have been recorded, a few stand out with particular clarity. Saganbey Orozbakov was born around 1,867 inches, what is now the Issyk-Kul region of Kyrgyzstan. He was, by the accounts of everyone who heard him, extraordinary. He could perform the epic for days without exhaustion. His version of Manas is estimated at over 500,000 lines, a number so large it is almost impossible to hold in the mind. For comparison, Homer's Iliad contains roughly 15,000 lines. Saganbey's Manas would take weeks to perform in its entirety. He was recorded by Soviet scholars in the early 20th century, a complex and important moment in the life of the tradition, which we will return to. What those recordings and transcriptions captured was a voice that had absorbed decades of the tradition and made it entirely his own. Scholars who study his version describe it as possessing a particular quality of forward momentum, as if the story is always arriving, never quite finished arriving, the next episode already pressing against the edge of the current one. He died in 1930. Jusup Mame was different in almost every way, except the essential one. He was born in 1,918 inches, the Xinjiang region of China, in a community of Kyrgyz people who had settled on the eastern side of the mountains, separated from the main body of the Kyrgyz people by borders drawn by powers that paid little attention to where nomadic communities actually lived. Mamai grew up in a world that was, if anything, even more isolated from the mainstream of 20th century life than the communities across the border. He learned the epic the old way from his father and grandfather, listening beside fires in yurts, absorbing the story across years of childhood and adolescence. He was never formally educated in the modern sense. He could not read or write for most of his life. But he could perform all three parts of the Manas trilogy, Manas, Semete, and Satek, the stories of the hero and his son and grandson in their entirety. His complete version runs to approximately 500,000 lines of verse. He performed it over his entire adult life and was still performing episodes in his 80s. When scholars finally reached him and began the work of recording his version, a process that took years, what they captured was something that felt genuinely ancient. Not because it was old-fashioned or simple, but because it seemed to carry within it layers of the tradition that had been preserved in that isolated community, away from the disruptions that had changed the tradition elsewhere. Mamai died in 2014 at the age of 95. At his death, he was described in Kyrgyzstan as a national treasure, which he was. But he was also something more specific and harder to replace. The last Manaschi who had learned the epic entirely through the old oral chain, from a teacher who had learned it from a teacher, in an unbroken line stretching back further than any written record. What does a Manaschi actually look like when he performs? The physical aspect of the performance is not incidental. It is part of the transmission. The Manaschi sits, usually. In formal performances he may stand. He begins in a measured, relatively quiet register, feeling the room, establishing the rhythm. His body begins to move in small ways. The head, the hands, something changes in the eyes, they go inward, or they go somewhere that is not quite the room he is sitting in. As the performance deepens, the voice changes. It rises and falls with the narrative quiet for the intimate moments, expanding for the great battles and declarations. The verse form itself carries the performer. The rhythmic pattern of Kyrgyz oral epic has a momentum of its own, and once a Manaschi is deep into it, the rhythm begins to carry him as much as he carries it. People who have watched great Manaschi perform describe something that is difficult to explain in rational terms. A quality of presence that seems to exceed the individual man sitting in front of them, as though the voice belongs to more than one person, as though something older than the Manaschi himself is speaking through him. Whether that is mysticism or simply the effect of an extraordinary performance of a human being completely inhabited by their craft, is perhaps not a question that needs answering. What matters is that it works, that the audience, sitting in the warmth of the yurt, with the fire at the center and the night pressing in from outside, is carried somewhere else, into a story that is also a world, into a world that is also a memory, into a memory that belongs to all of them equally. That is what the Manaschi does. That is why, for as long as the tradition has existed, people have gathered to listen. Every great story has a world. Not just a setting, a backdrop against which events happen, but a world with its own logic, its own weight, its own way of making certain things possible and other things impossible. The world shapes the story as much as the story shapes the world. And if you want to understand what Manas is really about, what it has always been about, you have to understand the world it moves through. That world is Central Asia, specifically the high grasslands and mountain valleys that the Kyrgyz people have called home for centuries. But it is Central Asia understood in a particular way, not as geography on a map, but as a living pressure, a set of forces pressing in from every direction, and a people holding their ground in the middle of it. The mountains are the first thing. The Tian Shan Mountains of Heaven run roughly east to west across the region, massive and permanent, and indifferent to human affairs. They reach altitudes above 7,000 meters at their highest points. Their passes are difficult in summer and sometimes impossible in winter. They divide the world, north from south, east from west, the grasslands of the steppe from the high valleys, where smaller communities lived in relative isolation. In the Manas epic, the mountains are not background, they are participants. Specific peaks are named, specific passes are fought over. The landscape has a moral quality. Certain places are associated with safety, with home, with the ancestors. Others are associated with danger, with the alien, with the world of enemies. When Manas rides into the mountains, the terrain itself responds to what is happening. A pass that opens easily is a good sign. One that closes in bad weather is an omen. This is not poetic decoration. It reflects a genuine relationship between the Kyrgyz people and their landscape. A relationship built over centuries of living in a place where the land could protect you or destroy you, often with very little warning. The rivers too are present named, specific, alive. The Sirdarya, the Chu, the Narin, which runs through the heart of what is now Kyrgyzstan in a series of dramatic gorges before spreading into the broader Fergana Valley. These rivers mark territory. They mark the boundary between what is ours and what is theirs. Crossing them means something. And then there are the enemies. The Manas epic is, among other things, a long meditation on the experience of living under threat. The Kyrgyz people, throughout much of their history, were surrounded by powers larger than themselves. The epic translates this historical reality into narrative with great directness. The principal enemies in the epic are the Kalmyks, also called the Oirats, a Mongolic people from the west of what is now China and Mongolia, who at various points in history exerted enormous pressure on the Kyrgyz and other Central Asian peoples. In the epic, they appear under the leadership of a figure named Kanykei, a powerful, implacable antagonist who is not simply evil in the cartoonish sense, but genuinely formidable. He is strong, he is intelligent, and he has resources that Manas and his allies struggle to match. This matters because it makes the conflict real. An epic hero who defeats a weak enemy tells us nothing interesting about strength or courage. Manas is interesting precisely because Kanykei is a genuine threat. The battles in the epic are not foregone conclusions. People die, alliances collapse, plans fail, and Manas wins when he wins through a combination of his own extraordinary qualities and the quality of the people around him. The Chinese Empire also features in the epic as a source of pressure distant, immense, and persistent. Here the epic is drawing on real historical memory. The relationship between the Kyrgyz people and the Chinese imperial state, particularly the Tang dynasty, was complicated and often dangerous. The epic translates this complexity into narrative terms. China is not a single villain, but a kind of gravitational force, pulling at the edges of the world the epic describes, always present even when not directly threatening. Other enemies appear and recede depending on which version of the epic is being told, which Manaschi is performing, and which historical period has most shaped his understanding of the world. The epic is not a fixed historical document. It is a living tradition, and different Manaschi emphasize different threats depending on the circumstances of their own time. Saganbey Orozbakov, performing in the early 20th century in a world where Russian imperial power had replaced older forms of Central Asian authority, shaped certain episodes with that context in mind without changing the epic's fundamental character. Jusuf Mamey, performing across the border in Xinjiang under Chinese governance, brought his own understanding of external pressure to the same material. The epic absorbs the world it moves through. That is part of how it survives. But if the enemies give the epic its tension, it is the allies who give it its heart. Manas does not fight alone. He cannot. The epic is not the story of a single superhuman figure overcoming everything through individual excellence. It is the story of what becomes possible when people who might remain separate, who have reasons to distrust each other, who come from different clans and different backgrounds and different ways of understanding the world, choose to stand together. The Kyrgyz, the 40 warriors, are Manas's companions, not simply soldiers. Each of them is a distinct individual with their own history, their own character, their own particular kind of strength. The number 40 is symbolic in the Kyrgyz tradition. It appears throughout the culture as a marker of completeness, of a full and sufficient number, 40 days of mourning. 40 years of age as the threshold of mature wisdom. The 40 warriors of Manas form a complete world around him. Among them, several stand out with particular clarity. Almumbet is perhaps the most interesting of Manas's companions and the most complex. He is not Kyrgyz by origin. He comes from the other side, from among the enemies, or at least from people associated with the enemies. He was raised in the Chinese court. He is, in some versions of the epic, of mixed heritage, and he chooses to leave all of that behind and join Manas. His arrival in Manas's camp is one of the great episodes of the epic. He comes as a stranger. He is not immediately trusted. How could he be? He looks different. He speaks the language of those who have been enemies. He carries knowledge that is useful precisely because it comes from the other side. But he proves himself, repeatedly, decisively, without complaint. And he becomes one of the most beloved figures in the epic, not despite his foreign origins, but partly because of them. Because his choice to stand with Manas, given everything he could have chosen instead, means something that the choice of someone born into the community does not mean in quite the same way. Almumbet is the epic's argument for inclusion, for the idea that a people is defined not only by blood and birth, but by commitment and action. Töshtük is different, simpler in some ways, though simplicity in an epic hero is never quite what it appears. He is fiercely loyal. He is an extraordinary fighter. He does not complicate things with doubt or divided allegiance. In a story full of difficult choices and moral ambiguity, Töshtük represents a kind of clarity, the man who knows what he stands for and does not waver from it. He and Almumbet are often placed together in the narrative, their contrasting characters creating a natural tension and balance. The complexity of Almumbet and the directness of Töshtük between them, they cover a great deal of human ground. And then there is Bakay. Bakay is old. He was old, the epic suggests, even before the story of Manas began. He is the counselor, the advisor, the one who has seen enough of the world to understand that courage without wisdom is simply speed in the wrong direction. He has known Manas's father. He will outlive Manas. He is the connective tissue of the narrative, the figure whose memory reaches backward into the world before the hero, and whose survival reaches forward into the world after him. In oral traditions, the wise old counselor is a common figure, but Bakay is more specifically drawn than most. He is not simply wise in the general sense. He is wise in the Kyrgyz way, knowing when to speak and when to be silent, knowing how alliances work and how they break, knowing that the hero he serves is extraordinary, but also mortal, and planning accordingly. What the world of the epic ultimately describes is a political problem that has no easy solution. The Kyrgyz people in the period the epic addresses were never powerful enough individually, as separate clans and communities, to resist the forces pressing against them. The only possibility of survival was unity. And unity between people who are proud of their independence, who have their own leaders and their own grievances and their own histories of conflict with each other, is enormously difficult to achieve. Manas is the figure who makes it possible, not through force or not through force alone, through something harder to define, through the quality of his presence, the clarity of his purpose, and his willingness to give everything he has to the project of holding people together. When the Manaschi performs the great assembly scenes, the Kurultai, the gathering of leaders, and describes Manas standing before representatives of dozens of clans and communities, calling them to a common cause, the audience is not hearing a story about the distant past. They are hearing a story about something that has always been necessary and always been difficult. Something that, in one form or another, is still necessary. The mountains are still there. The steppe is still wide. The question of how scattered people hold together against a larger world is still being asked. And in the yurt around the fire, the Manaschi is still providing the same answer he always has. Not a strategy, not a plan. A story. In the middle of a story about warriors and battles, and the great difficult project of holding a people together, there is a woman. She does not carry a weapon. She does not ride into battle. She is not described in the epic primarily in terms of what she fights or defeats. She is described in terms of what she holds, what she keeps, what she refuses to let go of, even when everything around her is falling apart. Her name is Kanykei, and she may be the most important figure in the entire epic. Not because the story says so directly. The epic spends enormous amounts of time on Manas, his strength, his campaigns, his great assemblies of warriors, his battles with Kanykei, and the forces pressing against his people. Kanykei moves through much of this as a presence rather than a protagonist. But pay attention to where the story goes when Manas is gone. Pay attention to who is left, who remembers, who acts, who ensures that what Manas built does not disappear into the ground with him. And then tell me she is not the most important figure in the epic. Kanykei comes from the Talas region, from a noble family in the world the epic describes. Her arrival in Manas's life is not a simple love story, though there is love in it. It is an alliance, a joining of two powerful families, two sets of connections, two different kinds of strength. This is how marriage worked in the world the epic describes, not primarily as a romantic arrangement, though romance was not absent, as a political and social bond, a way of weaving communities together, of creating obligations and loyalties that would hold even when individual feeling might falter. A good marriage in that world was one that made the community stronger, and by that measure, Manas and Kanykei's marriage is extraordinary. But what makes Kanykei genuinely remarkable, what has kept her alive in the tradition across so many centuries of telling, is not her lineage or her beauty, though the epic speaks of both. It is her mind. She thinks clearly when the people around her are thinking with their fear. She speaks carefully when the people around her are speaking with their anger. She sees further ahead than most of the warriors and advisors in the epic, not because she has some supernatural gift of foresight, but because she is paying attention to the things that other people, in their urgency and their pride, tend to overlook. There is a moment in the epic that captures her character better than any summary can. Manas is preparing for a great campaign, one of the large-scale military expeditions that punctuate the narrative. The mood in the camp is one of excitement, of warriors sharpening weapons and testing horses and talking loudly about what they will achieve. Kanykei is quiet. She has been watching, she has been listening, and she has noticed things, small things, individually perhaps not alarming, but in combination deeply worrying. The signs are not good. The timing is not right. The alliances are not as solid as they appear. She goes to Manas and she tells him this, carefully, specifically, without drama. He does not fully listen. This is not because he is foolish. Manas is not foolish. But he is a man surrounded by warriors who want to fight, carrying the weight of his own reputation and the expectations of everyone around him, and the voice of caution, even the voice of his wife, whom he respects, is harder to hear than the voice of urgency. He rides out, and what Kanykei predicted comes to pass. She is not vindicated in a triumphant way. The epic does not pause to note that she was right and he was wrong. It simply continues, as life continues, with the consequences of choices made under pressure. But the audience knows, the Manaschi knows, and the knowledge sits there in the narrative, quiet, significant, unavoidable. Kanykei was right. She was right because she was paying attention in the way that people who carry responsibility without power learn to pay attention. Without the option of simply acting, she had learned to observe. And observation, in the long run, produces a different kind of knowledge than action does. Her role as healer is equally important and equally underappreciated in quick summaries of the epic. Kanykei is a healer. She carries knowledge of plants, of remedies, of the body's capacity to recover if given the right conditions. In the world, the epic describes a world without hospitals, without trained physicians in the modern sense, where battle injuries were common and infection was a constant danger. This knowledge was not a minor domestic skill. It was the difference between life and death, repeatedly. Manas is wounded in battle on more than one occasion, and more than once it is Kanykei who brings him back. Not through miracle or magic, though the epic sometimes frames it in terms that brush close to the miraculous, but through knowledge, through patient, skilled, determined care. She stays awake through the nights when he is at his worst. She prepares what needs to be prepared. She does not allow the people around her to give up, which is sometimes the most important thing a healer can do. Simply refuse to accept that recovery is impossible and act accordingly. In the tradition, this aspect of her character is connected to a broader understanding of women's knowledge in Kyrgyz culture. The knowledge of plants and remedies, of childbirth and its complications, of how to maintain health through the difficult conditions of steppe life. These were genuinely technical bodies of knowledge, held primarily by women, transmitted from mother to daughter in the same way that the epic was transmitted from Manaschi to apprentice. The epic honors this, not loudly, not with formal speeches of recognition, but by making her healing essential to the story's survival. Without Kanykei's knowledge, Manas dies earlier. Without Manas, the epic ends. She is, in the most literal sense, the reason the story continues. And then Manas dies. We will return to the circumstances of his death in a later chapter. But for now, what matters is what happens after. The world that has been built around Manas, the alliances, the community, the sense of purpose and direction that he provided, is suddenly without its center. The warriors who followed him are grieving and uncertain. The political situation, which was always complicated and is now without the figure who held it together by force of personality, is dangerous. And Kanykei acts. She organizes the great memorial feast, the funeral rites that will become one of the most significant episodes in the entire epic. a gathering that draws people from across the steppe to remember and honor what Manas was. This is not simply a ceremonial responsibility, it is a political act. By bringing people together in shared mourning, she is rebuilding the community at the moment when it is most at risk of fragmenting. She protects her son, Semitei. This matters enormously. Semitei is the future, the continuation of what Manas represented, the next generation through whom the story will continue. In the dangerous political situation following Manas's death, the child is at risk. There are those who would benefit from the end of his line. Kanykei shields him, sometimes by hiding him, sometimes by maneuvering with considerable political skill through the competing interests of those who surround them. She carries the story forward. In the oral tradition, Kanykei is sometimes described by the Kyrgyz word akılman. It means wise, but in the way the word is used, it carries more than simple intelligence. It suggests a kind of wisdom that is patient, that works over long time scales, that holds its conclusions lightly enough to revise them when new information arrives. The opposite of the warrior's wisdom, which is fast, decisive, and necessarily committed to a single course of action. A people needs both. The warrior's wisdom builds the thing. The akılman's wisdom keeps it alive. Manas builds, Kanykei keeps. And in the logic of the epic, and perhaps in the logic of the culture that created it, keeping is the harder work. Building is dramatic. It has a shape, a visible arc, a moment of completion. Keeping is quiet. It is daily. It is the accumulation of thousands of small acts of attention, care, and refusal to let go of what matters. The epic knows this. That is why Kanykei is still here, still present in the tradition, still named and remembered and honored centuries after the Manaschi first found words for her. There is something else worth saying about Kanykei, and it concerns the women who heard her story. For most of the history of the Manas tradition, the primary audience for the Manaschi's performance was mixed men and women, elders and children, gathered together in the warmth of the yurt for an evening, or a night, or several nights of telling. The men in that audience heard Manas. They heard Almambet and Chubak and Bakai and the great warriors of the Kirk Choro. The women heard Kanykei. They heard a figure who moved through an epic about warriors and battles and great political struggles, and who was, in all of it, absolutely essential, who was never reduced to decoration or reward, who had knowledge, exercised judgment, made decisions that mattered, and was respected, genuinely respected, not merely praised by the people around her. She was not a modern figure. She existed within the constraints of her world as everyone does, but within those constraints, she was fully realized, fully present, fully herself. And for the women listening in the yurt, in a world that also had its constraints, that fully realized presence was a kind of recognition. You are here. You matter. The story knows you are here. That is what Kanykei gave them, and gives them still. When a hero dies in an epic, the story usually ends. The dragon is slain, the city is taken, the quest is completed, and the narrative closes around the hero's final act, like water closing over a stone. The hero's death is the punctuation mark. Everything before it was the sentence. After it, silence. The Manas epic does not work this way. When Manas dies, the story does not close. It opens. It expands outward into something larger than the life of any single man, into the community he leaves behind, into the rituals they perform to honor him, into the next generation who will carry what he started. and into the long, slow work of remembering that a people must do if they are going to remain a people. The death of Manaschi is not the end of the epic. It is, in many ways, its center. And at that center stands a feast. The great memorial feast held after Manaschi's death is one of the most extraordinary episodes in the entire tradition. It is not simply a funeral. It is not simply a gathering of mourners sitting quietly with their grief. It is enormous. It is loud. It lasts for days. It involves competitions, horse racing, wrestling, archery, the kinds of physical contests that the Kyrgyz tradition has always used to mark important occasions. It involves feasting on a scale that requires the combined resources of many communities. It involves people traveling from vast distances to be present warriors, leaders, ordinary families who felt the weight of Manaschi's life and want to stand in the same place where he is being remembered. Kanykei organizes it. We have already spoken about the political dimension of this, the way the gathering rebuilds community at the moment of its greatest fragility. But there is something else happening in the that goes beyond the political. The feast is a form of memory. Not memory in the quiet, private sense, the individual recollection of a person sitting alone with their thoughts. This is memory as collective practice. Memory performed publicly, in front of witnesses, through actions that the body remembers even when the mind begins to forget. The races, the contests, the songs, the stories told around the fires at night, all of it is the community saying, together, out loud, we remember who he was. We remember what he stood for. We are not going to let that disappear. And in saying it together, they make it true. This is the logic of oral culture, and it is worth pausing on because it is genuinely different from the way literate cultures tend to think about memory and preservation. In a culture with writing, the standard approach to preserving something important is to write it down, put it in a book, an archive, a database. Create a fixed record that exists independently of any individual human memory. The record persists, even if everyone who was present at the original event dies. Future generations can access it without needing a human intermediary. The oral culture's approach is almost the opposite. The thing is preserved not by being fixed, but by being repeated, not by being stored, but by being used. The epic lives because people tell it. The memory of Manaschi lives because people gather and race horses and sing songs and listen to the Manaschi's voice rising in the night. Stop the repetition and the thing begins to fade. Continue it, and it remains not identical to what it was before, because no telling is ever identical, but continuous with it, recognizably itself across centuries of change. The is this logic made visible. The community gathers not, despite the difficulty of gathering the distances, the expense, the disruption to ordinary life, but because of the difficulty. Because the effort is part of what makes the gathering meaningful. Because a thing that costs nothing is worth nothing, and a memory that requires no work to maintain is a memory that is already beginning to slip away. Now, this chapter carries a second name, a Töshtük. And here we need to move sideways for a moment, not away from Manaschi, but alongside him, into the broader world of Kyrgyz oral tradition, of which the Manaschi epic is the largest, but not the only element. Töshtük is another hero, a different story, one of the great narrative traditions of the Kyrgyz people that exists alongside Manaschi, related to it in spirit and in form, but separate in content. The story of Töshtük is remarkable in itself. Töshtük is born to parents who have waited a long time for a child, 40 years, in the telling, which, as we have established, is the Kyrgyz number for completeness and sufficient duration. His birth, like Manaschi's, is accompanied by signs of the extraordinary. He grows up gifted. He becomes a great rider and warrior. But the story that defines him is not a battle. It is a descent. Töshtük's horse falls into a crack in the earth into the underworld beneath the steppe, and Töshtük follows it down. What follows is a journey through a world that exists beneath the ordinary world, a world with its own geography, its own creatures, its own rules. Töshtük must navigate this underworld, face its dangers, and find a way back to the surface. He is helped by figures he meets along the way, tests his strength and his wit repeatedly, and eventually returns changed, as all journeys into the underworld change their traveller, but returned. Why does this matter in a chapter about the great feast and the living tradition? Because Töshtük and Manas are not separate phenomena. They are part of the same living body of oral culture. The Manaschi who performs Manas may also know episodes of Töshtük. The audience that gathers to hear one has almost certainly heard the other. The two traditions breathe the same air, and the themes they share are revealing. Both heroes descend into difficulty from which ordinary return seems impossible. Both are sustained not only by their own strength, but by the help of others, companions, advisors, figures who appear unexpectedly and offer what is needed. Both return changed, and both leave something behind that the community must carry forward in their absence. The underworld journey of Töshtük and the death of Manas are, in the deep structure of the tradition, the same kind of event: a loss, a descent, a community left without its hero. And in both cases, the tradition's answer is the same. You gather, you remember, you tell the story. The gathering is the work, the telling is the preservation, and as long as both continue, nothing is truly lost. There is a specific episode in the Great Feast section of the Manas epic that Manaschi return to again and again, not always in the same words, but always with the same weight. After the races and the contests and the great communal meals, after the political negotiations that such a gathering inevitably involves, after the formal speeches of mourning and honor, after all of this, the night comes. And in the night, around the fires, the Manaschi begin. Not one Manaschi, many, because the gathering that Kanykei has assembled draws not only warriors and clan leaders, but storytellers. Each community that sends representatives to the Az sends its Manaschi too, and in the night they perform. They tell episodes from the life of Manas, different episodes, different versions, shaped by different regional traditions and different understandings of what the story means. The audience moves between the fires. They listen to one Manaschi for a while, then another. They compare versions, notice differences, argue quietly about which telling captures something true and which has perhaps drifted from the core of it. Children fall asleep against their parents' shoulders and wake to find a different voice telling a different episode. The epic is alive. It is not in a book. It is not in a single authoritative version. It is distributed across all these voices, all these fires, all these listeners, and the distribution is not a weakness, but a strength. If one voice falls silent, the others continue. If one version drifts too far from what is recognizable, the community's collective memory corrects it gently over time. This is what a living tradition looks like. Not a monument, not an archive, a gathering, a fire, voices in the dark. The Great Feast also contains something that every oral tradition must eventually confront. The question of what happens to the story when the generation that knew it best is gone. At the Ars, the oldest Manaschi are present, the ones who learned from the generation before them, who carry versions of the epic that nobody else carries anymore. And they know because they are old enough to know that what they hold will not pass perfectly to the next generation. Something will be lost in the transmission. Some detail, some episode, some particular way of handling a difficult moment in the narrative, it will not make the crossing intact. This is not despair. In oral cultures, this kind of loss is understood as natural. The tradition is not a perfect copy machine. It is a living thing, and living things change. The tree that stands now is not identical to the tree that stood 100 years ago on the same ground, but it is continuous with it. It has grown from the same roots. The great feast is the moment when the tradition looks honestly at its own mortality and decides, collectively, to continue anyway. Not because continuation is easy, not because everything will be preserved, but because the alternative silence is unacceptable. The fires stay lit, the voices keep going, the children keep listening. And in the morning, when the feast begins to disperse and people start the long journey back to their own camps and valleys and mountain pastures, they carry something with them, not written down, not recorded, carried in the body, in the memory, in the rhythm of a verse that will come back to them, unexpectedly, riding across the steppe, lying awake in a yurt, sitting beside their own fire on an ordinary night. Manas, still there. In 1856, a young Kazakh scholar named Chokan Valikhanov arrived in the Kyrgyz steppe. He was 21 years old. He had been educated in the Russian imperial system, trained as a military officer, shaped by the intellectual currents of 19th century Russia, fluent in Russian and several other languages. He was also deeply connected to the culture of the steppe, to the oral traditions of his own Kazakh people, and to the broader world of Central Asian life that the Russian Empire was in the process of absorbing, studying, cataloguing, and transforming. Valikhanov had heard about Manas. He had heard that somewhere among the Kyrgyz people there existed an oral epic of extraordinary size and power. He wanted to find it. He did. He spent time among the Kyrgyz, listening. He recorded what he could, not the full epic, which was far beyond what any single researcher with a pen and a finite amount of time could capture, but episodes. Significant portions, enough to understand the shape of what he was dealing with. When he returned and wrote about what he had found, he described Manas as a monument of folk poetry, unlike anything he had encountered. He compared it, carefully and with awareness of how large the claim was, to the great epics of other traditions. He said that what the Kyrgyz had was something the world should know about. He was right, and his account was the first time the outside world, the literate, documentary world of European scholarship, took serious notice of the tradition. But noticing and preserving are very different things. The question of how the Manas epic survived across the centuries before Valikhanov found it is not a question with a simple answer. It survived the way all oral traditions survive, imperfectly, partially, through the accumulated effort of people who cared enough to keep going. There was no single institutional home for it, no monastery where monks copied it onto vellum, no royal library where a definitive version was stored under careful conditions. There was only the chain of transmission, Manaschi to apprentice, elder to child, voice to listening, ear stretching back through generations that left no written record of themselves. This chain had broken in places. Certain episodes, certain regional variations, certain ways of handling particular moments in the narrative. These had been lost when the Manaschi who carried them died before passing them on. Wars disrupted transmission. The great upheavals of Central Asian history, the Mongol period, the various conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries, the pressures of the Kalmyk expansion all created conditions in which ordinary cultural transmission became harder. Communities were displaced. Families were separated. The elderly, who carried the deepest layers of the tradition, were often the most vulnerable. And yet the chain held. Not perfectly, but well enough that when Valikhanov arrived in the 19th century, he found something recognizable as a single tradition across different communities and different Manaschi, different versions, different emphases, different episodes privileged or diminished, but Manas, unmistakably Manas. The tradition had survived because it was distributed, because it lived in many minds simultaneously, because the loss of one carrier, however painful, did not mean the loss of the whole. After Valikhanov, other scholars came. The Russo-Finnish ethnographer Wilhelm Radloff recorded further episodes in the 1860s and 1870s, working with Kyrgyz informants to transcribe what he heard. His methods were imperfect by later standards. The process of translating an oral performance into written text is always a translation in the deeper sense, not just between languages, but between modes of existence. A text on a page is a static thing. The performance it was derived from was alive, responsive, shaped by the moment. Something is always lost in the crossing. But something is also gained. A written record persists in ways a voice cannot. It can be carried to other places, read by people who were never in the room, studied by scholars with different questions than the ones the original recorder was asking. The Radloff transcriptions, for all their limitations, gave the tradition a kind of existence outside itself, a shadow on paper that would outlast the specific moments of performance from which it was drawn. Then came the Soviet period, and here the story of the tradition's survival becomes considerably more complicated. The Soviet Union arrived in Central Asia in the 1920s, and with it came a set of attitudes toward traditional culture that were, to put it carefully, contradictory. On one hand, the Soviet intellectual project placed enormous value on the documentation of folk culture. Scholars were sent to collect oral traditions. Recording expeditions were funded. The idea of preserving the cultural heritage of the various peoples within the Soviet Union was taken seriously, at least in principle. On the other hand, the Soviet project was fundamentally hostile to exactly the kinds of values and social structures that the Manas epic embodied and celebrated. The epic was deeply connected to pre-Soviet Kyrgyz society, to the clan structures, the nomadic way of life, the Islamic elements woven into the tradition, and above all to a form of identity and belonging that was not organized around the Soviet state, but around something older and more local. This created a tension that the tradition navigated with difficulty. There were moments when Manas was celebrated. The Soviet state found it useful to claim the epic as a piece of Kyrgyz national heritage evidence that the Kyrgyz people had a rich culture worthy of respect, which in turn supported the narrative that the Soviet system was protecting and elevating this culture. Large-scale scholarly editions were produced. The epic was studied in universities. Saginbey Orozbakov's version was transcribed and published in multiple volumes. But the celebration was selective and ideologically shaped. Certain elements of the epic were emphasized its themes of collective action, of a people united against external enemies, of the ordinary man finding strength through community. These fitted the Soviet narrative reasonably well. Other elements were quietly set aside. The Islamic religious content was minimized or reinterpreted. The clan-based social structures the epic celebrated were awkward, given the Soviet project of dissolving exactly those structures. Episodes that were too deeply embedded in pre-Soviet ways of understanding the world were sometimes omitted from the versions that received official approval and wide distribution. The Manaschi continued to perform, but they performed in a changed context, sometimes at official events, sometimes as approved representatives of Kyrgyz folk culture, always aware of the boundaries within which they were permitted to work. Some Manaschi navigated this with remarkable skill. They kept the tradition alive by finding within it the elements that the Soviet state could tolerate, while quietly preserving, in performance, the elements it could not. The live performance was always slightly beyond the reach of complete official control. A text could be edited. A voice, in the moment of performance, was harder to censor. Steppe Remembers survived the entire Soviet period without fully entering its orbit. Living in Xinjiang in China, he was beyond the reach of Soviet cultural policy. He learned from his father and grandfather in the old way. He performed for his community in the old context. He was not studied by Soviet scholars, not shaped by Soviet editorial decisions about what the tradition should look like. When scholars finally reached him in the 1980s and began the long work of recording his complete version, what they found was a form of the tradition that had developed along a different path, less processed, less shaped by outside intervention, carrying elements that had been lost or suppressed in the Soviet Kyrgyz versions. His existence proved something important about the resilience of oral traditions. The distribution that had always been the tradition's strength, the fact that it lived in many minds in many places, simultaneously, had protected it even from the most systematic attempts to reshape it. In the valleys of Xinjiang, far from the scholars and the official editions and the ideological pressures, the epic had continued. Quietly, faithfully, in the old way. In 1995, Kyrgyzstan, newly independent after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, celebrated what was officially designated the 1000th anniversary of the Manas epic. The designation was somewhat arbitrary. Nobody knows exactly when the tradition began, and 1,000 years is a round number chosen for its symbolism rather than its precision. But the celebration was real, and the symbolism was powerful. A newly independent country finding its footing after 7 decades of Soviet rule reached back into its deepest cultural heritage and said, "This is who we are. This is where we come from. This is what we have carried across all the difficulties of our history." Manas 1000, as the celebration was called, involved events across the country. Scholars gathered, Manaschi performed, school children learned episodes by heart, monuments were erected. The epic was placed, formally and deliberately, at the center of the new nation's sense of itself. It was also the moment when a difficult question became impossible to ignore. What happens to an oral tradition when it is written down, when it is recorded, when it becomes, through the very act of preservation, something fixed? This question had been present since Valikhanov first put pen to paper in 1856. But by 1995, with multiple written versions in existence, with recordings on tape and later on digital media, with scholarly editions running to many volumes, the question had become urgent. The written versions were not the epic. They were records of specific performances by specific Manaschi at specific moments. They preserved what was said, but not how it was said. Not the quality of the voice, the physical presence of the performer, the responsiveness to the audience, the 1,000 small decisions a Manaschi makes in real time as he moves through the story. More than that, the written versions created something the tradition had never had before, a canonical text, a version that could be pointed to and compared against, a standard from which other tellings could be judged to deviate. And deviation in a living oral tradition is not error, it is the mechanism of survival. The tradition stays alive precisely because each Manaschi brings something of his own to it, his own understanding, his own emphasis, his own interpretation of what the story means for the moment in which it is being told. Fix the text, and you fix the tradition. Fix the tradition, and it stops being a living thing. It becomes a monument. Beautiful, perhaps, important, certainly, but no longer breathing. The tradition has not stopped breathing. There are still Manaschi, not as many as there once were the conditions that produced them in large numbers, the world of the steppe camp and the long winter nights, and the oral culture as the primary means of preserving knowledge. Those conditions have changed enormously. But the Manaschi exist. Young people still learn. The dreams still come. The question of how the tradition will survive the 21st century, with its written texts, and its digital recordings, and its schools, and its internet, and all the other technologies of preservation and distraction that now surround it is genuinely open. But then, the question of how it would survive has always been genuinely open. It survived displacement and war. It survived the Mongol period. It survived the collapse of the nomadic way of life. It survived 7 decades of a political system that was, at best, ambivalent about it. It survived because there were always people who cared enough to keep going. People who sat beside fires and listened. People who felt the story enter them and understood that they were now responsible for carrying it forward. People who, when the time came, opened their mouths and began. The world was different each time. The story was the same. Bishkek is a city of wide boulevards and Soviet-era architecture, of new glass buildings rising alongside old concrete ones, of markets and universities and traffic, and the particular energy of a capital city that is still deciding what it wants to be. It is not, at first glance, a place that feels like the steppe. But stand in Alatu Square, in the center of the city, and look up. There he is. Manaschi. The statue is large, the kind of large that makes you stop walking and simply look for a moment. He is on horseback, as he almost always is, in visual representations of the tradition. The horse is caught mid-movement, one leg raised, the whole figure carrying a sense of forward momentum. Manas himself sits tall, not stiff, one arm extended in the gesture of a leader, pointing the way forward, or perhaps simply indicating the direction of something important just over the horizon. Around the base of the monument, inscriptions, episodes from the epic. Words that most Kyrgyz people will recognize immediately, not because they have read them in a book, but because they have heard them. In school, in performance, at family gatherings, from the television on national holidays. The monument was erected in 1981, during the Soviet period, when the official relationship with the epic was still complicated and carefully managed. But it survived the transition to independence and remained, was in fact given new significance, new prominence, new layers of meaning by the fact of independence itself. He is here. He is not going anywhere. Walk through Bishkek and Manas is present in ways that are easy to miss if you are not looking for them. The international airport carries his name. You arrive in Kyrgyzstan through Manas International Airport. The first thing the country offers you is the name of its hero. Streets are named for him. Institutions bear his name. The currency, the som, carries his image on certain denominations, a face that is imagined rather than historical, but recognizable to anyone who knows the tradition. This is what it looks like when a culture's deepest story becomes part of its official identity. When the thing that was carried in memory across centuries of difficulty is finally, formally, written into the architecture and the currency and the name of the airport. It is both more and less than what the tradition was before. More in the sense of visibility, of official recognition, of the state's acknowledgement that this story is central to who the Kyrgyz people are. The Manaschi who performed beside fires in the 19th century, who navigated the complicated politics of the Soviet period, who kept the tradition alive through conditions that were often deeply hostile. They would perhaps recognize something satisfying in the fact that Manas now stands in the central square of the capital. Less, in a way that is harder to articulate but important. Because a statue is fixed, a monument does not breathe. It does not respond to the audience or the occasion. It does not make choices about what to emphasize tonight, given who is listening and what they need to hear. It stands there, the same in all weathers, saying the same thing to everyone who passes. And the tradition at its most alive was never that. In the schools of Kyrgyzstan, children learn Manas. Not all of it the complete epic, even in its shortest scholarly versions, would take more than a school career to absorb, but episodes, key moments, the birth of Manas, the great assembly of warriors, the campaign against the Kalmyks, the death and the memorial feast. Children learn verses by heart. They recite them in class. At certain national holidays and school events, students perform episodes not as casual readings, but as genuine attempts at the Manaschi's art, with the rhythmic delivery and the physical engagement that the tradition requires. There are competitions, regional and national competitions, in which young people perform episodes from the epic before judges who are themselves versed in the tradition. The competitors are sometimes very young, 10, 11, 12 years old, and watching a child of that age stand before an audience and deliver verse in the old style, with the old rhythms, carrying a story that is perhaps 18 centuries old, is an experience that is difficult to describe neutrally. It is moving, simply and directly moving. Not because it is perfect the young performers are learning, and learning means imperfection, but because the act itself carries so much. The chain of transmission, stretching back so far. The choice, made again in each generation, to carry this particular thing forward, rather than letting it go. The question teachers and scholars discuss sometimes openly, sometimes with the caution that important questions deserve, is what is actually being transmitted in these school performances. The technical elements can be taught. The verse forms, the characteristic phrases and formulas that recur throughout the epic, the names of the characters, and the broad shape of the narrative, these can be learned in a classroom. And learning them is not nothing. It is the foundation on which something larger might grow. But the tradition at its deepest level was never primarily about technical mastery. The Manaschi who received the story in a dream was not describing a technical process. He was describing something that happened to him, something that arrived unbidden, that changed him, that gave him access to a way of being in the story that went beyond conscious knowledge. The great Manaschi of the tradition, Saginbai, Mamai, and the others whose names have been preserved were not simply people with good memories and technical skill. They were people in whom the tradition lived in some deeper sense, people who were inhabited by it. Can that be taught in a school? Can it survive the transition from the yurt to the classroom? The honest answer is, probably not entirely. Something changes in the crossing. Something always changes in the crossing. But something also survives. The question is whether what survives is enough. There are Manaschi working today. Not the vast number that existed when the steppe was the primary world, and the oral tradition was the primary means of cultural transmission. But they exist. They perform at official events, at cultural festivals, at private gatherings that are closer to the old context. Families and communities assembled not for a formal occasion, but simply to hear the story. Some of them are young. This is important. The fear that haunts discussions of endangered oral traditions is that the practitioners are all old, that the tradition is in its last generation, performing its own slow funeral. For Manas, this fear is not without basis. The conditions that produced Manaschi in large numbers are genuinely gone, but the tradition is not confined to its oldest practitioners. There are young men and occasionally young women who feel the call of it, who sit with the elders and listen in the old way, who begin, cautiously at first, and then with growing confidence, to perform, who describe, when asked about how it began for them, experiences that sound remarkably similar to the dreams that the old Manaschi described. Manas appears, he speaks, and afterwards something is different. The relationship between Manas and Kyrgyz national identity is something that scholars and politicians and ordinary people discuss with a complexity that sometimes gets lost in the official version. The official version is relatively simple. Manas is the foundation of Kyrgyz identity, the proof of the culture's antiquity and richness, the hero who embodies the values the nation aspires to. This version is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because Manas, in the actual tradition, is not a comfortable figure. He is not simply an inspiring symbol suitable for monuments and school curricula. He is a man who makes mistakes, who loses people he loves, who dies at the edge of victory, in circumstances that are contested and unclear. He is a figure of enormous power and genuine tragedy. The tradition has always held both of these things simultaneously, the greatness and the tragedy, the inspiration and the loss. It has never resolved the tension between them, because the tension is the point. A hero who only inspires and never fails tells you nothing true about the world. A hero who carries both, who is genuinely great and genuinely mortal, tells you something you can actually use. The monument in Alatu Square shows the inspiring version. The Manaschi beside the fire shows you the whole thing. There is something happening in Kyrgyzstan today that is worth paying attention to. Alongside the official institutionalization of Manas, the monuments, the curriculum, the airport there is a quieter movement. People returning to the tradition, not through official channels, but through personal connection. Families where grandparents teach grandchildren episodes that were not part of the school curriculum. Young scholars who are not satisfied with the published editions and go looking for living practitioners, for the performance rather than the text. A growing awareness that what the written versions and the monuments preserve is real but partial. That the full tradition, the living, breathing, performed tradition, requires human carriers, requires the chain to continue, requires someone willing to sit beside the fire for years and listen before they open their mouth to speak. This awareness is not universal. It coexists with the forces that pull in other directions, the pull of modernity, of connectivity, of a world in which the kind of deep, slow attention required to become a Manaschi is increasingly rare and increasingly difficult to sustain. But it is there. And where it is there, something continues that no monument and no written edition can fully replace. The steppe has a long memory, Not because it preserves things perfectly. It does not. Things are lost. Things change. The steppe of today is not the steppe of the 9th century. And the Kyrgyz people of today are not the people of that time in any simple, continuous sense. But memory is not about perfect preservation. Memory is about the refusal to let the most important things disappear completely, about the willingness in each generation to make the effort that continuation requires, to learn what the generation before learned, to add what the current moment demands, to pass it forward, changed but continuous, to the generation that comes next. The steppe remembers Manas not because it has been told to, not because there is a law requiring it, not because the monument stands in the square or the name is on the airport. It remembers because there are still people who choose to remember, who sit in the warmth of a room, a yurt, a school, a family living room, and open their mouths and let the old words come. And in the old words, something lives that nothing else quite captures. A people, a landscape, a story that knows it is not finished yet. The fire has been burning for a long time now. The wood has settled into itself, no longer flames reaching upward, but a deep bed of coals glowing orange and red in the darkness, throwing a steady warmth across the floor of the yurt. The light it casts is softer than it was at the beginning of the evening. Faces that were sharp and animated hours ago have gone quieter. Some people have shifted position, pulled a felt blanket across their legs. A child who was sitting up, watching the Manaschi with wide eyes, is now asleep against her mother's side, her breathing slow and regular, her face completely peaceful. The Manaschi is still speaking. Not loudly, not with the rising intensity of the great battle scenes he delivered earlier in the night, when his voice filled the yurt and the audience leaned forward, and the horses outside seemed to shift and stir as though they too were listening. He speaks quietly now, steadily. The rhythm of the verse is still there. It is always there, the underlying pulse that holds the performance together, but it has become something closer to breathing, something the body does without deciding to. He is not performing for effect anymore. He is simply continuing. There is a question that people sometimes ask about the Manas epic, and it is a question that sounds simple until you sit with it. When does it end? The answer the tradition gives is, it doesn't. Not in the way that most stories end with a resolution, a final image, a closing of the circle that was opened at the beginning. The Manas epic does not work that way. It continues through Semete, the son of Manas, who carries forward his father's unfinished work and faces his own set of impossible difficulties. It continues through Saitek, the son of Semete, another generation, another set of struggles, another accumulation of loyalty and loss, and the difficult work of holding people together. And even Saitek's story does not close completely. The tradition simply continues to the edge of what the Manaschi knows, and then stops. Not because the story has reached its conclusion, but because the performance has reached its natural end for tonight. Tomorrow night, or next week, or next year, another Manaschi will begin again, and the story will continue from wherever it was left, or from wherever it needs to begin again. The epic does not have a last page. It has a pause, and the pause can last a generation or a night. And when someone begins again, the story is still there, still moving, still unfinished. This is not a flaw in the tradition, it is its deepest truth. Think about what it means for a story to have no end. In most narrative traditions, particularly the written ones, a story earns its existence by resolving something. It poses a question and answers it. It creates a tension and releases it. The ending justifies the length. The closure makes the journey feel worthwhile. The Manas epic is built on a different logic entirely. It is not trying to answer a question. It is trying to hold a question open. The question it holds open is the same question the Kyrgyz people have always lived with, the same question every people who has ever felt the pressure of a larger world pressing against them has lived with. How do we remain ourselves? How do we hold together when everything pulls us apart? How do we pass forward what matters when what matters cannot be written down, cannot be stored, cannot be preserved by any means other than the willingness of one person after another to care enough to carry it? The story continues because the question continues. The epic has no ending because the struggle it describes has no ending. Not because nothing was achieved, much was achieved heroically at great cost, but because achievement is never final. Every generation inherits the achievement of the previous one and must then defend it, extend it, pass it forward in the conditions of their own time. Manas knew this, or rather, the tradition that shaped him knew this, which is why it made him mortal, which is why it gave him a son, and gave that son a son. The hero is not a solution, he is a beginning, and beginnings by their nature require continuation. There is a moment that experienced listeners to the Manas epic sometimes describe a moment that happens, not at any fixed point in the narrative, but somewhere in the deep middle of a long performance. When the night is well advanced, and the fire is low, and the Manaschi has been speaking for hours. The moment when you stop being an audience and become part of the story. It is hard to describe precisely. Something shifts. The boundary between the world of the yurt and the world the Manaschi is describing becomes permeable. The mountains he is naming feel like the mountains outside. The wind he describes feels like the wind you can hear against the felt walls. The grief of Kanykei feels like something you have felt yourself or witnessed in someone you love. The courage of Manas feels like something you have needed yourself or will need. The story stops being about other people in another time. It becomes about this, about now, about the specific people sitting in this specific yurt on this specific night, with their specific joys and difficulties and uncertainties and hopes. That is what the great Manaschi can do. Not just tell you about another world. Make you feel that the other world and your own world are the same world, seen from different angles, at different moments in the same long story. When that happens, the epic is doing what it was always meant to do, not preserving the past, illuminating the present. The Manaschi pauses again. This pause is different from the others, longer, more deliberate. He looks at the fire for a moment, then at the faces around him, then somewhere past all of them, somewhere in the middle distance, where the story lives when it is not being spoken. He has been doing this for hours. In a longer, more formal context, a festival performance, a multi-night gathering, he might continue until dawn. Tonight the occasion is quieter. The fire is lower. The children are asleep. The adults are at the edge of sleep themselves, that soft, permeable state where the boundary between listening and dreaming has dissolved. He makes a choice. Not to stop, not exactly. The story does not stop, but to release the audience, to bring the performance to a resting place, which is not the same as an ending. A place where it is possible to set down what you are carrying for tonight, knowing that you can pick it up again. He speaks a few closing lines. They are not a conclusion. They are more like a door left ajar, the room still there, the story still present, but the immediate urgency of the telling gently suspended. Then he is quiet. In the silence that follows, something remains. Not the specific words he spoke, those will blur and soften with sleep, the precise verses dissolving, even as the shape of what was said stays present. Not the plot, exactly the sequence of events that was narrated through the long evening. Not any specific image or episode or moment of drama. What remains is harder to name. A feeling of having been somewhere, of having sat for a few hours in a world that was larger than ordinary life and yet entirely made of ordinary things: loyalty, fear, love, courage, loss, the difficulty of holding together, the grief of losing what you love, the stubborn refusal to stop trying. A feeling of company, of not being alone with any of it. The story does not give you answers to the questions that made you sit down beside the fire in the first place. It does not tell you what to do, or promise that things will work out, or offer any of the consolations that we sometimes seek from stories. What it gives you is something quieter and more durable. The knowledge that these questions, your questions, the ones that feel most particular and most difficult, are not new. That people have sat with them for centuries, have found ways to carry them, have found ways to continue. That continuation is possible. That is enough. Tonight, that is enough. Outside the yurt, the steppe is completely still. The horses have stopped moving. The wind has dropped to almost nothing, a breath rather than a presence, barely enough to move the grass. The stars are at their most intense, the way they get in the last hours before morning, when the sky seems to deepen rather than lighten. The mountains are invisible in the darkness, but present you know they are there, the way you know certain things without needing to see them. The camp is quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness. This is a full quiet, the quiet of many people breathing slowly in sleep, of a community that has gathered and eaten and listened and is now resting. The yurts glow faintly from within, the last embers of their fires still giving off a soft warmth. Smoke rises from each one in a thin, straight column, perfectly vertical in the still air, rising until it disappears into the darkness above. Everything that was said tonight is still here, present in the air, in the people who heard it, in the particular quality of quiet that a long night of storytelling leaves behind the silence that knows it contains something, that is not empty but full. In a few hours the camp will wake. The morning will bring its own demands, animals to tend, water to fetch, food to prepare, the ordinary work of a day that has no patience for last night's stories. Life will resume its forward movement, as it always does. But something from tonight will come with it. A word, a line from the epic that surfaces unexpectedly while someone is working, arriving fully formed as if it had always been there. An image Kanykei looking out from the yurt door toward the mountains, or Almambet riding into the camp as a stranger, or Manaschi at the assembly of leaders, his arm extended, pointing toward something just over the horizon. The story travels with the people who heard it. It continues in them, in the small invisible ways that stories continue shaping what they notice, what they value, how they understand the world they move through. This is how it has always worked. This is how it still works. The fire has gone out. Not dramatically, not all at once. It simply burned down through the night, coal by coal, until what remains is a circle of grey ash and a warmth that will linger for a while yet in the felt walls and the thick rugs and the air of the yurt. The Manaschi is asleep. The story is not. Manaschi is not a figure you can summarize. He is not a lesson, not a symbol, not a national monument, not a museum exhibit, not a UNESCO designation, not a line in a school curriculum, though he has been all of these things and will continue to be. He is something older and simpler than any of that. He is what a people said to itself, in the dark, across centuries of difficulty. We are still here. We remember. We have not forgotten what we are. And then they said it again, and again, until the saying became a story, and the story became an epic, and the epic became the longest thing a human voice has ever carried from one generation to the next without writing a single word down. Tonight, somewhere on the steppe, or in a city apartment, or a school, or a room where a family has gathered, and an elder has begun to speak, someone is telling it again. Not the same words, never exactly the same words, but the same story. The fire, the voice, the darkness, the listening. And Manas, still riding, still moving towards something just over the next ridge, just beyond the next pass, in a landscape that goes on and does not end because the steppe does not end, and the story does not end, and the people who carry it forward have not yet decided to stop.